A pleasure to meet y'all at last, and welcome back to films I should have talked about years ago. This one in particular, I probably have to warn you right off the bat. It's incredibly different from the likes of what I've said already from other movies. And because I've adjusted the focus, hopefully that can help you take me a bit more seriously on this one. We're going to talk a bit about The Fly. This in particular is going to be solely about the 1986 remake, based off of the cult classic 1958 horror movie. About a scientist who is brilliant yet eccentric, but convinces a reporter to come by in his lab so he can help test out an impressive invention, the first kind of teleportation machinery. Now, teleportation is in fact the process of which that matter is simply broken down, anything that's inside the tube, and disintegrated at a molecular level, and then is replicated in another tube. So essentially, there's two bodies. One tube holds the old body, the current one that basically entered inside, and completely disintegrates it, leaving zero trace of it at all. And then in the other tube, it completely reforms, theoretically giving you a clone of the original. But the thing is that quantum data, as it's referred to, is simply what allows the body to be completely reformed exactly how it was before it got disintegrated in the entrance tube. Because when it exits out of the exit tube, it should be the exact same thing as the first one. But in this case, it's basically a horrifying genetic mutation that takes place. The scientist himself, known as Seth Brundle, who in this film, this remake of course, is played by Jeff Goldblum. You might remember him from the likes of many great movies over the years, including the Jurassic Park / World series, and not to mention the Cats and Dogs. But there's also Geena Davis. Yeah, that's right. Goldblum and Davis. Together at last. Now, Davis has also had a pretty notable career throughout her many years, up until the sad news came where unfortunately she lost her eyesight. Other than The Fly, 1986, we've also seen her in films known like Thelma and Louise and Stuart Little, just to name a few. But above all of that, to see them both together in this one movie, years before their biggest years ever happened, is a pretty nice, solid treat. To see these two for the very first time, possibly the oldest roles that they could have ever occupied before they became well known in terms of acting, sure does say a lot for anything, possibly. But what we got here is the combination of a scientist and a reporter basically getting together, at first talking to each other at a table, and eventually going to the lab itself. The teleportation tubes are there, and there's also an old school computer. In this case, it's so old school that it apparently is beyond high tech. For the time, in 1986, computers hardly had a lot to do with high-end elaboration. As in, computer programs today are so above and beyond. The metaverse itself solely does rely on the combination of programming and coding, by all means. But back in the 80s, it was incredibly primitive. You could probably get little more than just illuminated text on a black screen. But here in The Fly, it becomes much more elaborate compared to what typical computers typically operate on. And that's simply because the creators wanted to make the computer seem as sentient and interactive with the users. So what happens here is that Dr. Brundle himself requests Veronica, the reporter, to simply get an inorganic material, an object composed of anything that is non-organic. And you'd probably be willing to guess exactly what she pulls out. Well, Davis is in fact wearing sheer stockings on the set. And she actually goes as far as to take one off and put it in the tube. Now, that certainly came out of nowhere when I first saw this. I mean, it was one thing to basically have, wow, women's clothes show off at all. But the thing is that this sort of attractive, stylish stuff. Yeah, I'm probably just going at it too deep here in a romantic way, but let's see if we can move on here. The stocking she takes off and puts it inside the tube basically gets disintegrated, and she assumes that it's destroyed beyond repair. But in reality, the second tube in the room actually showcases the exact same sheer that she was wearing to begin with. So in other words, Brundle simply explains to her that what just happened was teleportation in action. So the thing is, he came up with a brilliant idea that could forever change mankind beyond all coincidence, or possibly beyond any known piece of progression that had already come around. It was one thing to have the likes of the inventions of certain things like the automobile, light bulb, television, and hundreds of other unique inventions. But never had it ever come to mind by anybody that teleportation could probably surpass the likes of cars, trucks, buses, trains, and other such modes of transportation. So the thing is, Brundle himself made probably one of the biggest breakthroughs to ever occur in scientific history. Veronica herself is so pumped to want to showcase his invention to the world, but unfortunately he refuses, for several reasons. But she, of course, persists, goes as far as to get a secret tape recorder and simply record a conversation that she has. When she stops it, she accidentally lets it become visible, so Brundle sees it, tries to get her to stop doing what she's trying to do, but she ends up leaving the lab, going back to her superiors, back at her workplace. Yeah, so basically, her own reporter's office, basically, her own boss basically explains to her that she does need to bring in a bit more than just that. A bit more than just a taped conversation with the scientist himself, and the discussions of the events surrounding teleportation and why it needs to be necessary. She does, in fact, want to try and get the word known, to try and boost ratings and views, and probably make a lot of money in the process, just by talking about Brundle's new invention. An invention that could change mankind in hundreds of different ways. When talking about various other things, though, relating to how the movie's plot takes place, it's especially important to know there's a lot of incredible, intriguing details that pop up. For example, Brundle's own explanation of this simply does refer to a couple of real-life intentions that some scientists from way back in the day tried to piece together. But let's not forget, teleportation may or may not be anywhere close to being perfected, to the point where it could be used for experimental purposes. Now, onwards with the rest of the plot here. Brundle himself does in fact go through some numerous attempts to try and get organic matter to transport between the teleporters correctly, and after some modding, some testing, and some altercations, he finally goes as far as to test it on a subject/pet that he has. A monkey, baboon, if you will. So, it's great to have your own personal guinea pig, a pet pretty much, to help you with your experiments. But eventually, one day, Brundle himself puts himself in the tube. He basically set the time limit on the computer to automatically set the teleportation, so he can go across the room all by himself with the usage of teleportation. And in this instance, it actually works. But not before something crawls inside the tube with him. Something tiny, impossible to see, and then it gets disintegrated along with him. When Brundle himself exits the tube, he assumes that everything is completely fine. But after some time passes, it became clear that once he exited the tube with the teleportation system, he became a completely different person. He was undeniably strong, very agile, and super pumped on energy, to the point where he was performing increased gymnastics and acrobatics around the whole room. He was swinging around on pipes like a gymnastics professional and basically just going all out all over the place. It turns out, whatever happened inside the teleportation system made him a much, much different person. Soon it is revealed, however, it's not just his physical appearance that's changed. It's also his mentality and emotional state. Eventually, it gets off to a point where he becomes so obsessed with his new self that he decides to go out and try to impress the crap out of other people. He actually goes as far as to go together with an arm wrestling match out in a bar. He makes a bet, and he actually goes in. A really strong guy tries to simply pin down his arm, but no matter how much might he puts into that arm and that fist, he just cannot get Brundle's arm down. Brundle seems pretty lanky in here, but he is able to snap his arm and completely expose the inside of it. That is brutal. It really is. I mean, could you ever imagine a guy arm wrestling another guy and then all of a sudden his arm freaking breaks, revealing a compound fracture and probably other parts of the inside of the arm itself? That is incredible. I mean, it's such a shocker. So Brundle basically goes in with a new girlfriend that he meets at a bar. Goes back to the lab, and eventually, when Veronica herself goes back to the lab as well, she discovers their secret relationship. Call it an affair or whatnot, but it's basically just what it is. And this is basically where things turn around really quickly. Thick hairs start appearing on Brundle's back, and Veronica herself actually manages to slice one off and takes it over to a lab to be tested. Not Brundle's, of course, but a different one. One that centers on forensics and DNA genetics. It turns out the hair that's growing on his back actually was not human. It was thick and very tough to cut through to begin with. And in this case, it's basically much more than that. The DNA that they were able to recover from the sample that Veronica grabbed actually was related to a housefly. Yes, a housefly. And this is quite possibly the spookiest part of the whole movie. Not counting, well, another part, which I will get to very soon. Don't worry about that. So, as more physical changes are apparent, not just the hairs, but also his skin starts looking all spotted and weird, and eventually his hands start looking kind of freaky. He puts gloves on and goes to the computer to try and elaborate on what exactly happened with the tubes themselves. He goes so far as to inquire an assimilation on what exactly had happened inside the first tube. The entrance tube that he went into set a timer specifically to teleport himself across the room, and it turns out genetic fusion had occurred between him and a fly. After some shots at the computer itself and some really impressive pieces that really make the computer more high-tech than what it should have really been. But I guess for 1986, they really needed to have some sort of custom piece for the set, just so they can basically make it definitely like a sci-fi film, what you'd see in Star Trek, for example. But the thing is that numerous pictures and numerous animations and whatnot showcase a fly had actually entered the tube with him. And when they were both disintegrated, the molecular genetic levels of each being were fused together as one. So this is basically where Brundle realized he had fused, at a genetic level, his DNA spliced, and now he is part fly. That is basically something you would have never expected to see ever in your life. One could only imagine that if you were to go in a teleportation tube right now and let's say a spider crawled in there by accident, you would be genetically fused together with the DNA of a Black Widow, perhaps. Or probably just a huntsman. But no matter what it is, a lot of us tend to elaborate on this stuff and to be very specific about how a teleportation tube works. Climbing inside the tube would be easy, but the real challenge is to be very careful about what happens. It should be worth noting. Nothing at all should be within the tube upon entering it, or even exiting the other tube. Because what'll happen? Your life will be completely changed before your very eyes. And you will definitely have so much more than you bargained for. As it becomes more and more apparent as the film goes on, Brundle's own mutation, his eventual transformation, which slowly takes place, many different limbs are replaced and lots of different physical, emotional, and mental states become so much more different than they originally were. But eventually what happens is that Veronica herself realized that because of Brundle's undeniable performance back there, she apparently is now holding a baby. She's literally carrying a baby inside her that possibly has the same genetic levels as Brundle's own gene-spliced fusion. In other words, she's carrying what could possibly be the likes of both a human and a fly bonded together as one. So she goes over to a clinic to talk about an abortion. Now, this is basically one of the most emotional parts of the entire film, because the way I see it, looking at this film now, the fact that it elaborates on abortion and how it apparently means so much to just one person, knowing what has been going on these days, after so many years of people being able to take care of their bodies from the inside out, this is what I see as one of the most depressing moments in my life. When it comes to viewing movies, there's a lot of things that happen, but coincidentally, it seems I found a moment where an abortion has to take place just to keep somebody alive. And because I'm now watching this at a time where this stuff is no longer legal, I mean, I really feel like I'm going to break down in tears, because that scene alone more than sums it up. It's beyond depressing. To notice extreme changes like this, to have undeniable, effects. Genetics should just be genetics. Instead, what they put together here is something undeniably nightmarish, beyond all coincidence. Well, anyways, as the mutations completely take place, Brundle eventually came to the idea that he and Veronica should go into the tubes together and become fused as one. He also tries to convince her to keep the baby as well. So in other words, his plan pretty much makes him the antagonist. And the former, person that Veronica did in fact have a bit of relations with before she moved on with Brundle, actually started to crawl back to her in a certain way that would convince her that she probably needs him again, just to keep her away from Brundle's horrifying ideas. His idea in particular about wanting to make her part fly, as well as her own baby. part fly. He had already basically given her a mutant child that could potentially get worse over time. But now he basically wants to try and force her to do the same thing, to become mutant and just a complete outcast in the world, just as he is. So that's basically what we see. As he completes his own transformation into the giant fly, it is just incredibly terrifying to see when it's fully completed. I mean, it's basically the high-end elaborate special effects that they put together the old school way, done with the usage of animatronics and extremely detailed bits and pieces, done by some of the finest effects creators that could ever be done. With all the people out there like Stan Winston and Tom Woodruff Jr., for example, it's guys like these, for example, that were able to make films, especially the horror variety, so convincing and so well played. But in this instance, it is just all freaking amazing. How they managed to put this all off together, it's really baffling to say the least. But anyways, in the end, the fly is shot to death by Veronica herself. After some fumbling and after some fails and whatnot to try and kill the creature, she finally manages to do it herself, blowing off its head and also being able to be eventually approved for an abortion. An operation that would potentially save her life from a horrifying, terrible mutant child that has part Seth in it. In other words, the child could also mutate into a giant fly creature. It would be possible at the very least. So, just like with a lot of things I've done out here, I'm especially proud to call myself elaborate and able to speak up on a lot of different things. So, hopefully you enjoyed this episode, and also hope you enjoyed the PSA that I did on abortion. How important it is for healthcare in general to be used by all Americans and all people in general. I mean, why it's no longer allowed to happen is just beyond me. In case you're wanting to know my score, well, it's simple. 8.3 out of 10.1 is pretty much what I give to this one. Great effects, a nice cast, well-detailed storyline, a pretty atmospheric soundtrack, and so much more. So, make sure that you like, subscribe, comment, follow me on social media, and stay on the Hollywood side.